This podcast episode was originally recorded for Mormon Sex Info and is being refurbished for your enjoyment here at the Healing Souls Podcast.
Hello and welcome. This is Natasha Helfer. And with me tonight, I have Issa Jones. She's a sex and couples therapist, owner of the Scottsdale Center for Sex and Relationship Therapy in Scottsdale, Arizona. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist and clinical sexologist, specializing in emotionally focused therapy, improving couples' communication, creative problem solving, enhancing intimacy, and increasing erotic desire. She has some great history working with couples around issues of sexuality, and tonight our topic is going to be about really getting a handle for our sexual identities, and I'll get more into that with her after I've given her a chance to say hello and introduce herself further. Hello.
Hello, Natasha. Boy, that was a mouthful, the introduction. So I'm really happy to be here, and I love the work that you do, and, it feels like a real privilege to be able to talk to your audience about sexuality, so thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to have you. I know I've met you at several conferences through ASECT and things of that nature, so it's been a real pleasure to connect with you. All right, so why don't we start with just kind of this idea about what it means to create a sexual identity?
Well, when I use that term, what I'm really talking about is coming up with a very conscious idea around who you want to be and how you want to show up sexually. So a lot of times I'll sit down with a client and they'll be struggling with desire, or they'll be struggling in their sexual relationship. And I'll ask them, tell me about, who you are as a mother, for example. And they'll have a real clear picture. I'm responsible, I'm involved, I'm, PTA president. They have these roles that they do in their mothering role. Who are you as a business person? And I'll have, again, really clear ideas around who they are and how they identify and show up in this particular role. And then when I ask them, who are you sexually? I get kind of a blank stare. Like, well, gee, I haven't really thought about that before. Who am I sexually? I don't really know. And so that's part of the work of sex therapy, is really understanding who you are sexually and who you want to be sexually and how you want to express your sexuality. We don't take the time for our sexual relationships or our sexuality, for that matter.
Okay, so you have just thrown out 500 really great things that we can talk about more in depth. So I love it. So let's start with this idea of sexual values. That's where I'm going to start, and then I'd like to move into some of your other material that you discussed, because I think that we start there. We start by being taught sexual values. And you're right, a lot of them have to do with danger. And
I want to actually speak to that if I came across gloom and doom, because I got really positive messages both from my faith, community, and also from my parents around sexuality. I remember asking my mom, were you a virgin when you got married? And, was it worth it? Because I remember I was really struggling, with a boyfriend and adolescence. And she said, the beautiful thing about sex when you're married is that it can prevent molehills from becoming mountains. And at the time, I didn't know really what a molehill was. I'd never even heard that term before. I'm like, molehill? I'm like, okay, I think I get it. But what she was saying was, sex is this wonderful thing that when you're married can prevent, little problems from becoming big problems, because it affirms your love and your commitment and your connection to one another. It kind of settles you down and reminds you that you love each other. So yeah, I absolutely got those messages, not only from my home, but also from the church. It's great.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not that you came across as gloom and doom, but I'm just thinking of some of the messaging that is a little bit more negative, like the sin next to murder, or just some of the, I think that oftentimes, unfortunately, the balance does tend to gear on the side of, this is dangerous. If you do this, you're going to have really huge regrets, and it's hard for some people to recover from that type of sexual education. But the good news is that there are some really wonderful gems that, like you're very well explaining, that your mother could say, hey, this is this is not just about having babies, for example, right? This is a glue. This is a form of connection with a partner that really kind of makes life more congruent and more connective throughout this partnership. So what a wonderful message you received there. But I think the reason I want to start with values is that oftentimes I feel like sexual values get very behavioral oriented. So in other words, don't touch these certain parts, don't touch yourself, don't cross these certain lines. And I find that oftentimes, for example, I'll get adolescents or young adults who are very proud of their virginity status, for example. But they're also, in the next sentence, describing quite a bit of sexual behavior, and so, and that's fine if you want to protect your, if you want to set a certain boundary for yourself and not cross a certain line as far as vaginal penile intercourse. But I think the reasoning there sometimes get lost, like I just want to I want to be able to create loopholes around these rules instead of saying more intrinsically, like, what are my values? Why do I want to be protective in these ways? It's not just about keeping my bishop or God happy. It's about what do I really feel is important for me?
Beautiful.
Does that make
sense? It makes complete sense. The way I think about this is an internal versus an external locus of control. And so, when somebody has the capacity to really identify their values around something, they experience a great deal of empowerment that you don't otherwise experience when you're just doing what you're supposed to be doing, or you're trying to abide by these rules and bending them in certain ways to get around them. So I like your idea of sexual values because it basically gives us governing principles. So as I alluded to earlier, I think one of the great ways to think about sexual values is do I feel good about myself? These are kind of the governing principles. Is this something that makes me feel good about myself before, during, and after? Is this something that I enjoy, that feels good? Is this something that both my partner and I are comfortable with? And I could say comfortable enough with, because here's the thing on that. It's unrealistic to think that you and your partner are going to like the exact same things in the exact same way. So, the way I like to look at it is if it's a 9 for your partner and it's a 4 for you, then it can be on the table. But if it's a 9 for your partner and it's a -2 for you, then it's off the table. Likewise, if it's a 9 for you and it's a 2 for your partner, it can be on the table. But if it's a 9 for you and it's a -4 for your partner, then it's off the table, because there is going to be some differences between what you find pleasurable and enjoyable and comfortable and what your partner does. So as long as the two of you are comfortable enough and you're paying attention to each other and honoring and respecting one another, then, those would be other kinds of values that you would want to help govern your choices around your sexuality. What you're talking about with, these kids, they're going by the rules, it's more rigid, based on behavior, versus the spirit of the law, Mormon, who can actually ask the questions and say, what is the intention of my heart? What works for my husband or my partner and I? And let those things be the things that inform what your values are, what you want to enjoy together sexually.
I love that you brought up this idea of being comfortable. This is something I often include in my presentations around sexuality, because oftentimes we've gotten the message that if you're uncomfortable, if there's some sense of discomfort in your, body or spirit, that means that you're dealing with something maybe from Satan or something that's not, a good influence, but there's lots of reasons why one may feel uncomfortable with something. It's new. I mean, if you think about the first time you learned about French kissing, I thought that was kind of gross, But by the time I was 15, I kind of changed my mind about that. So it's just so new things are uncomfortable. And I think there is great value in being willing to maybe stretch yourself in the comfort zone as long as you feel safe overall with your partner.
Right.
with that idea that just because I try this once or twice doesn't mean I always have to try it, but I'm willing to at least start engaging in this type of thing that it seems like my partner really enjoys.
Right, and to acknowledge that we actually have a great deal of control around what is comfortable. So in other words, how we think about something determines how we experience it. So for example, in the case of, a woman giving a man oral sex, if she thinks of it like, oh, this is where he pees, oh, this is dirty, oh, then you're going to have a high level of discomfort with that experience. If you think of it, on the other hand, this is the most vulnerable part of his body. This is something that, he's so identified with around his manhood, this part of his body. And if I can administer and love this part of his body, he can experience kind of nurturing and my love for him in a way that cannot be matched any other way. You know what I mean? And if you have discomfort around cleanliness or smells, then, those are easy fixes as far as, you can share an oral sex after a shower, or, you can clean up before, whatever. Or if it's because you don't like, oral sex needs to be a gift, in my opinion, in order for it to work out well. So, if it's a guy who's demanding or a husband who's demanding oral sex, it's not a gift. And if a person can't say no, then they can't say yes either. So, if you get angry at your partner for saying no, then your partner really isn't free to say yes, because you've set up this kind of dynamic in the relationship. So, it's really great just to kind of look at what you're uncomfortable with, and to kind of think about what makes you uncomfortable with that, or what about that makes you uncomfortable, and to see if there's something, if there's some fixes around that. If it's a hygiene issue, you can clean, or you can do things in the bathtub, or if it's just a way of thinking about things, you could ask yourself, is that true? What makes that true? Is there another way I could experience this that would make it more comfortable, or not? Or maybe you just decide, I'm not comfortable with it, and that's a firm stance, and you're entitled to that position as well. But it's just nice to know that as you mature and as you experience things in your relationship, it's nice to be fluid. It's nice to go back and revisit things, and it's nice to experience each other in new ways. And that's actually, quite frankly, one of the ways that we keep eroticism alive in our relationships, is by experiencing new aspects of ourselves and our partner, sexually. And so instead of sex being a foregone conclusion, how it's going to end before it even begins, that's not very exciting. But when you're willing to kind of look at sex as an exploration and an adventure, and a place that you go, a space that you enter, I like how Esther Perel talks about this, that, animals have sex, but eroticism is sexuality transformed by the imagination. And really only humans have this divine capacity to eroticize our sexuality in a way where we can bring our imaginations to it. We can experience different parts of ourselves sexually that we may not get to experience in our lives outside of our sexual relationship. And I could tell you more about that, or we could talk more about that if you're interested in that. But I'm right there with you on the idea of comfort, and re-examining that in a way that might be helpful.
Yeah, no, I love everything that you've said. I think what you're really bringing up is how one of our major sexual organs is our brain, right? It's how we think about ourselves, how we think about our partner, and how we think about sexuality in general, and the power of the reframe, which is a very common therapeutic technique, right? So how do you take a certain thought about something and kind of shift it into some other possibility? And that's a really powerful thing that you said, especially with the oral sex example, which, all of these things can go both ways with both genders.
Yeah.
And I think that this also, what I'd like to talk about, which reminded me, which kind of goes with the consent issue too, is, so many couples deal with libido differences, and, sometimes it's the male who's the higher libido partner, sometimes it's the female. Of course, we're talking about heteronormative relationships here, but this is also true in same-sex relationships. But so I think this idea of consent, and even this idea that I might, in order to want to have sex, I need to first be aroused. and not really understanding that maybe arousal comes later as you choose to engage, even if you're not aroused, and that you can choose to engage and be a consenting, willing partner, even if it's not maybe the top priority of what should be happening in that moment. Right? This is what's hard when you've got maybe kids or grocery lists or all kinds of things going through your head, and even and that sexuality doesn't have to necessarily be about both of us culminating in orgasm or having the same experience, that we can really share a lot of fun and playfulness, even if it's quick and short and just meets certain people's needs at certain times of their marriage.
Right. That's why I like the idea of a sensual energy exchange, because, we don't have to define sex as intercourse. And you're right, it opens up so much more possibility for eroticism in our relationships when, we think of just sprinkling eroticism in our relationships. So maybe you're not up for intercourse, but, you'd really maybe enjoy like a 30-second long, kind of a heartfelt, relaxing makeout kiss, kind of a juicy kiss. And that's one of the things that is, if you think about it, it's 30 seconds. But if you can kind of take a breath and relax and kiss your partner in this sensual way, for 30 seconds, it can actually start producing this oxytocin and start motivating the sexual response in a way that you wouldn't even realize possible had you not, given it those opportunities to kind of stoke. And, one of the biggest problems that people have is they start avoiding those kinds of sensual energy exchanges because they interpret that, and maybe rightly so, that this is going to lead to sex. So it's strings attached. So they don't even want to be sensually touched or, kissed in this way because they think there's strings attached. So, if a couple can start having conversations, because avoidance is one of the biggest problems that or one of the biggest cancers, I will say, that metastasizes, because once somebody starts avoiding, then the other person starts feeling rejected, and then you get into this really negative cycle. So when you're talking about these desire discrepant relationships, you're right. It's unrealistic to think that both people are going to want sex at the same time every time, or want sexual energy exchange at the same time, every time. And what I like to tell people is that, especially in a long-term relationship, there's this switcheroo that happens. So most of your coming of age is, you experience desire, which is the mental state, before the arousal, which is the physiological state. So you're like, God, that guy is so hot. And then you date him, and then you make out, and, it kind of goes from there. But once you're in a committed, loving relationship, the chances, especially for the female, are pretty slim that you're going to feel that kind of desire before arousal. So, I like to say, willingness is the entry point. So, it's willingness. If you're willing to go there, well, then you'll just see what your body does. And if your body does become aroused and you're relaxed, then the desire can be born out of the arousal instead of the arousal being born out of the desire. So it kind of switches. But I also think it's important to underscore this difference between, spontaneous desire and responsive desire, because, most men, not all men, of course, and this is never 100% either way, but generally speaking, more men experience spontaneous desire, which just means like, boom, they want to have sex. They've got the desire. They're looking for a window. They want to have sex. Most women tend to, especially after they've been into a relationship and they're dealing with lots of multiple roles, tend to have more responsive desire, which is more contextually dependent. And so when a couple comes in and they're talking about mismatched desire, and we kind of slow down that conversation. When I talk to the person who has low desire, we talk about, well, why should you have desire? Is where did you get the idea that you should have desire? And what would be the kind of sex that you would desire? And what would be the circumstances around that? And, if a woman who's busy working or raising small children or completely overwhelmed or tired, the last thing she's going to feel is in touch with her desire. So it's really what I like to call more of a context disparity as opposed to a desire disparity. In other words, she needs, in this case, a different context to become interested in sex than he may need. And so the question is not what's wrong with you that you don't have spontaneous desire like me, which is kind of the male as this default standard that goes unchecked. It's more, what kind of context, baby, would turn you on? And maybe she'll give you some ideas like, well, if I came home and I didn't have so much housework to do, or if I felt better about myself and I was able to do, some art classes, or if I was able to, go shopping and maybe get some sexy lingerie or just have some time for myself, these are the things that might make me feel more motivated for sex. And that's why I like to do this exercise, and we can even do it here to role model it, which is, one exercise I got from Gina, and I've heard Esther use it as well, which is, I turn myself off. I turn myself off when, or I turn myself off by. And so I'll have the couple go back and forth. Like, I turn myself off when I read my email before I go to bed. I turn myself off when I'm tired. I turn myself off by thinking I'm fat. I turn myself off when I never have time for myself. I turn myself off when the house is a mess. All these kinds of things that we do to turn ourselves off. And then ask the reverse question, which is, I turn myself on when, or I turn myself on by. And then you start getting a clue around context. So do you want to try it with me?
I would love to.
Okay, so...
And by the way, we're talking... You mentioned Gina, so that would be Gina Ogden.
Yeah.
Who's a leading sex therapist in our country.
Right.
And yes, and you mentioned Esther Perel, so...
Exactly.
I'll be linking to some of their work as well.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I love and adore both of them. Okay, so let's do I turn myself off. So I gave a few examples already, but it's true. Like, I turn myself off when I'm tired, and then you bounce right back.
Okay, so I have to tell you something that happens for me. Okay.
Just quick. Don't think about it.
Okay. All right. I turn myself off when I am stressed out.
Okay. I turn myself off when I feel fat.
I turn myself off when I'm worried about the next day's activities.
I turn myself off when I'm mad at my husband.
I turn myself off when I don't like my body.
I turn myself off when I feel like I'm a cruddy mom.
I turn myself off when I am super tired.
I turn myself off when I don't exercise.
I turn myself off when I overeat.
I turn myself off when I don't take time to do my hair and makeup and put myself together well.
I turn myself off when I watch too much TV.
Great. So you see how this can go.
Yeah.
So you start really getting a sense of how you turn yourself off, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm starting to get depressed.
I know. This is why you do this one first. This is like a little note to self. Is there any therapists out there? Do this one first and then end on a high note. End on this one.
Right.
So the next question is, I turn myself on when, or I turn myself on by. So kind of take a breath, transition into a different space, and maybe even kind of think back into a time when you were a little more turned on and say, okay, what was going on then? Okay, so I turn myself on when I'm rested.
I turn myself on when I smile or laugh.
Okay, I turn myself on when I see my husband doing something that's really thoughtful of either me or our kids.
I turn myself on when I'm flirty.
Ooh, I turn myself on when I wear sexy underwear.
I turn myself on when I have kind of dressed up or felt good about myself all day long.
Good. I turn myself on when I listen to music, especially like music from the 80s.
Ooh, I like the salsa. So I turn myself on with Latin music.
Okay, great. So there are these contexts that we can use. So, for example, we've identified music, so audio. We've identified just states, like mind states, physiological states, when you're tired, when you feel good, when you're rested, or when you're not stressed. These are contexts that can allow people to get in touch with their desire. And so these are the important things to look at. And if a sexual relationship is important to you, if you decide, you know, this is something that's important to me and something I value and I want to enjoy in my relationship, then just like anything else that's important to you, your calling, your kids' lives, your finances, whatever else you value, then you make it a priority. And so, like the research shows that, John Gottman did some really good research on long-term couples that report having a very fulfilling sex life over time, and he found they have two things in common. One is they have a good friendship. They get along. They like each other. And two is they make their sexual relationship a priority, which means they create a space in their schedules for it. And, when we are as busy as we are with, like I said, callings and household management and jobs and kids' activities and, all the things that we can do, my belief is unless you actually plan and create a space, an intentional space for an erotic practice, it's not going to happen. You'll basically be one of these couples that, goes to bed exhausted and thinks, God, maybe we should have sex, or I don't know, it's probably we should, and, I say if you don't have enough energy to play a round of tennis, then you probably don't have enough energy to really enjoy being sexual with your partner. Because it's a physical activity. So, one of these really common mistakes that people make is, thinking that sex is just going to spontaneously happen, or thinking they're just going to be motivated spontaneously. And couples who do that end up kind of with the awareness that, whatever's going to spontaneously happen in our relationship and our long-term relationship already has. This is it. So if you want to create something different, then I suggest having an erotic practice, which would be maybe an hour, and you guys decide when that is, where you get a babysitter or you go to a hotel, or you create a space in your lives where you can just enjoy being together, being sensual together. And, I think it's important because as I go back to one of my sexual values is that it is the one thing that distinguishes you and your partner as lovers. It's the one thing that distinguishes your relationship as special and different from any other relationship you have, is this connection that you get to share sexually. So I think it's important. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this work. And I think that the couples that capture that vision, that really grab onto their sexuality and want to enjoy it and grow it in a way, do great with it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think going back to values again, you mentioned that oftentimes, people who come in to see you will know how to answer the questions about other types of roles, right? So like my role as a mother or a father or a career person or whatever it is that they're doing.
Honestly, a lot of times parents will put so much energy and time and attention and creativity and responsiveness into their kids' lives. I call it Eros redirected. Actually, I first heard that from Esther Perel as well, where she talked about how, when we think about eroticism, what we're really talking about is life-affirming energy. So most people don't really complain about the frequency of sex. Most people, at least when they come to my office, they're complaining about the lack of quality or vitality or energy that they thought sex would provide, or that sex once did provide in their relationship. So it's gone from being this life-affirming, fun, intense experience to something else, to a transactional experience or nothing at all. So, kids, I like to tell parents who kind of focus all their energy on their kids, and I call it Eros redirected, or on their jobs, that, the number one gift that at least I believe you can give to your kids is two parents that have an erotic connection. And so why isn't that a priority? Why isn't that on the checkbox? Why don't we have an erotic practice that's built into the schema for what's important? And you know what? The truth is, if it's our own internal value, like we talked about before, then, you take it to God and you decide what your priorities are. And if you feel like this is an important priority between you and your husband, and you want this to be the glue and the gift that you give to each other and to your family, that you two are going to nurture and cultivate this erotic connection, then more power to you,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
That's great.
it's easier to say no when there's a greater yes burning within. I love that quote from Stephen R. Covey because, and this is why I say it's really important to come up with a sexual vision for yourself and for your couple. And that's kind of borrowing on the work of Barry McCarthy, how he talks about, really becoming an intimate team and creating a sexual style together that's going to meet both of your needs. So, the two of you sit down and you start asking each other, what do you want to experience sexually? What do you long for? What turns you on? What's important to know about you sexually? What does sex mean to you? When do you feel most erotic? Is there something you sexually long for? What's a sexual dilemma for you? There's lots of things to explore around our sexuality with our partners, and then together to come up with kind of a mission or a vision statement, which I have essentially all my couples do that are trying to work on this. This vision can pull you forward when a couple comes back and says, I want to experience closeness and connection and pleasure in our sexual relationship, and you want to feel comfortable with my sexuality, and we can kind of craft a really clear vision for what it is they want to create sexually, so what they want to say yes to, so it's a lot easier to say no to all the other competing priorities.
Okay, so in all of that, you're hitting on a parenting value is something that you mentioned, because I do think, I totally agree with you that so much of how our children go on to be partners themselves is what they've seen, as they grow up. Or at least you're giving them a lot more tools to, if you have a positive relationship, to go do that in an easier way for them. So there's a parenting value. I also heard you talk about really a value of your partner's erotic stances or position. And this can get a little tricky, I think, because again, it's if your sexual values have to do with, soulmate type connection, and you're only going to think of me, every single, act or thought is going to be about, I don't know, rainbows and, ponies or whatever, then it can be a little bit threatening or scary when maybe your partner shares some erotic fantasy or ideas that don't necessarily fit this kind of more sacred or holy type of language that sometimes we use for sexuality. So can you talk a little bit about that, and how do we help couples start really being able to be present in safe spaces for somebody to really be able to disclose maybe something that is a little bit off kilter or that they might be thinking about.
Right. That doesn't maybe fit into this kind of romantic ideal. So what we're talking about is, how can you become a sexual team when maybe you bump up against some disparities between what turns your partner on and what your partner's interested in, and what turns you on and what you're interested in. Is that kind of where you're going? Especially when the assumption going in is that, sex is more stylized around this intimate, loving kind of connection, and that's very different than maybe a power exchange or somebody who has a fetish that wants to incorporate that into their lovemaking.
Yeah, so you have a man who says, well, I really enjoy wearing women's underwear. That's something that maybe you didn't expect to hear, as a wife. Or you have a wife who says, well, I really have this fantasy that somebody is kind of overtaking me and even, forcing me to do things. And the husband's really taken aback by that, doesn't know how to even role play that because that's not how he feels about his wife, right? Or you have somebody who maybe is really turned on by the idea of being watched sexually, so if somebody was watching us, that really kind of turns me on, or having a threesome, things that maybe they would never consider doing in real life, but that are still arousal ideas or imaginations or playfulness that doesn't fit into obviously the LDS construct of what maybe they feel like their sexual, how healthy sexuality is defined.
Yeah. So, this is complicated. Okay. So first of all, sexuality and our sexual wants and fantasies, are vulnerable, and so there's good reason why people are afraid to talk to their partner about their sexual desires and in fantasies, because they're afraid it's not going to go well. So, I think this is why sex therapy is a great space to have these conversations, because, we can create a context. So the first thing you want to understand about sexuality is that it's not politically correct. In other words, the way the erotic mind works is different from the way your mind works as a responsible citizen. And so, for example, what people fantasize about at night might be the very thing they protest against during the day. A lot of, for example, I find women who have grown up in a culture where they've been very conservatively dressed and have kind of made conscious choices not to be the object of men's desire, to call attention to themselves. They might have a fantasy where, they're dressed scantily clad and like men can't take their eyes off of them, for example. Not that they would really want to be that person in real life, but that's what they find arousing, because it's fantasy, and fantasy is not reality. So the other big piece of this is understanding fantasy better. That we have different kinds of fantasies. We have fantasies that just turn us on to think about, and we have that we don't necessarily want to act out, and we have other kinds of fantasies that we actually are interested in experimenting with. And so, to be clear on which it is. And so typically if I have a couple where one person has expressed a fantasy that the other person, that they'd actually like to act out upon, that the other person is really not interested in, then, we can kind of take the elevator down and maybe find a common denominator that the partner, that they could incorporate some aspect of it in. So, for example, let me just think of a quick example. Like if a guy really has a fantasy of a three-way, and the woman says, "Geez, there's no way that's happening," then maybe if they were to watch some kind of erotica while they're making love, so it kind of felt like there's other people in the room, something like that, or they imagined there's people watching them, even though they're not. Because remember, we talked about eroticism is sexuality transformed by the imagination. You can really imagine anything and eroticize it, even if it's not actually happening in the room. So we'll work with imagination.
Tell each other stories while you're having sex. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is where role play comes in. If you've always imagined being with a redhead, well, just imagine me as a redhead, or whatever. Or three-way, just you can imagine like putting your hands on your partner in a way like, oh, can you feel her hands touching your neck, and they're really your hands, or it depends on the context of your relationship. There's so many other variables in this, so I don't mean to oversimplify it. When I kind of take the elevators down, the core principles for me is that the people in the relationship, there's a spirit of goodwill, there's enough trust, there's enough secure attachment where they can go into this erotic playground and play together. And if somebody does a misstep, if something happens that hurts or that didn't feel good to me, that you could recover because you've got each other's backs. You know what I mean? So even though you're kind of playing and you're trying on different kinds of ways of being sexual together, if it doesn't work out, that's okay, because you're in this context where you really do love about each other, and you really do love each other, and you've got each other's backs. If you don't feel safe, so if you're in a relationship where you feel emotionally disengaged and you don't feel like your partner has your back, well then that's where you start, to build the foundation, because in order to feel safe, kind of asserting your sexual autonomy, you need to feel like your partner has your back. And if you don't, then that's where you start, is in just building that trust and emotional intimacy in the relationship.
Yeah, I just did an interview with Joe Court, and he brought up this idea that a lot of times these playfulness or these fantasies that we have can seem like a threat. So if you like a redhead, but you're with me and I'm a blonde, what does that say about me? There must be something lacking in me, or you must not be attracted to me. And he was really pointing out, look, it has really nothing to do with you. That's just something that's there. We have very little control over maybe what kinds of things turn us on. And this partner of yours is actually, first of all, telling you about this, which is vulnerability. And that takes a lot of trust to even tell you something like that. And then secondly, if you act out on something like this together, where, you go get a red wig, and put it on, or whatever you want to do to be playful about it, your partner is still choosing you to be sexual with, right? So even though there's these fantasies that might include things that seem threatening, it's not so threatening when you reframe it to be like, yeah, but we do this together. This is our thing. And it doesn't matter that we have these otherizing fantasies. It's still our relationship, and we do this in a way that's safe and fun for us.
Right, exactly. And it's all about context, though, because if that same couple is disconnected, arguing, not sharing their lives really, then that's not going to feel good. But if that couple is engaged with each other emotionally, responsive to each other, then you can have that level of trust and that level of confidence that you're enough for your partner, because your partner communicates that inside and outside of the bedroom. So it is, I think, so important to really appreciate the context around the sexual relationship, because it doesn't occur in a vacuum. And, I think one of the biggest things that kind of interferes or subverts this for a lot of women and men, I guess nowadays I'm seeing a lot with men, is sexual self-image or sexual body image. So a lot of women think that, for example, if their partner looks at erotic imagery and he is turned on by these other kinds of bodies, that means her, he's not attracted to her, for example. Same kind of thing. If he wants he has a fantasy about a redhead, then he doesn't like her brunette hair. And like you said, it's nothing further from the truth. I mean, the research really shows that, what makes a woman attractive, what makes a woman sexy is, confidence and responsiveness. So it's a woman who expresses that there's nowhere else she'd rather be than making love with her partner, in that, at that time. So, I think a lot of women get hung up on body image and things like this. And I like to say to the women, like, hey, if you're the only naked woman in the room and your partner loves you, like you're the hottest thing on the planet. You got nothing to worry about, And it takes a long time for women to really get that message. But I do see that a lot, where women feel like they're not attractive enough, they're not sexy enough, because they don't look like a Victoria's Secret model. And it's important for women to get to a place of self-acceptance, and instead of worrying about how their body looks having sex, they start enjoying the sex they're having, because that's what actually makes them sexy, is when they're embodied and they're enjoying the sex they're having versus they're spectating and worried about how their body looks, And that's true for men too, worrying about how their penis looks and, if it's rigid enough, or, worrying about, how muscular they are. So, if both people can just look at each other and feel like they're enough for each other, then all that stuff can just be shed in a way that just allows you to just enjoy being together, skin on skin. And I think that's another myth, I think, to really bust, is that only, young, beautiful bodies are eligible for great sex. That's just not true
Absolutely.
at all. Yeah.
There are, I do want to just mention, there are some partners that will shame, their person for how they look. And that's really unfortunate when that happens. But for the most part, I totally agree with you that just showing up and being an active role player versus a performer is exactly what is wanted. And the research on men is really interesting, because they need connection as well. They need to feel desirable as well. All these things that we think are just women's issues is really just as much issues for men too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I believe that's completely true. And I think that's where, men get the shaft a lot is, a lot of times women feel like, gee, he's just looking for a warm place to put it. What they don't realize is that, for men and for women, but particularly for men, when men have been raised in a way that they haven't been allowed to express their emotional vulnerabilities and their emotional needs in the same way that women are allowed to. Like they can't, most men, by the time they're 5 or 6 years old, have a pretty clear idea around, what's allowed and what's not in terms of the male code to express. And so where do all those emotions go? They just kind of stay in the body. And so, I know for the men that I see, I have yet to meet a man who doesn't want to be desired sexually by his wife or by his partner because that is the primary way that he feels wanted and loved and valued and seen by his partner. It's an emotional currency. It's not a sexual one. So, sex is easy to get nowadays. I mean, whether you're in or out of the church, it's 10 minutes away, for anybody with a phone. So, it's so important to really understand that what people are really longing for is something far, far more than just the sexual interaction. It's really the feeling of being wanted and desired and valued by each other and feeling like you're enough.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. So you mentioned Barry McCarthy's work on couple sexual style. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know he's got a book out that I can link to, and he talks about 4 specific styles. At the same time, we were talking before the interview, and you had mentioned too that you feel it's a little bit more complex than just 4 couple styles, but yeah. But it's a good place to start, or at least to have a conversation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with his work, but not that familiar that I know the 4 couple styles right off the bat. So it's probably a good book to read as a starting point if people are curious about this. What I like to do is ask couples, and I have a worksheet for couples that they kind of fill out, what do you want to experience sexually? Is it playfulness? Is it spiritual connection? Is it power play? Is it ease and comfort? So it's like what I envision for a more fulfilling sexual relationship includes. And again, it's not just this one in this only one way or only one sexual style. I like to help couples develop like a buffet of different kinds of sexual experiences that they can enjoy together, in the same way that one day you might just have time for a quickie, you might just have time for an appetizer. Another day you might have your erotic practice where you can spend time on a full course meal. Another day you just might want something a little kinky and hot, and it's the dessert, you're just grabbing a dessert. So I like the idea of having some variability. But on this worksheet, I would invite couples to think about, what qualities do they want their sexual style to embody? So, is it ease and comfort? Is it relaxation, revitalization, fun, passion, excitement, affirmation of being desired, affirmation of being loved? And that's different because affirmation of being desired is something like, gosh, you're so hot, I want you. Getting those kinds of text messages. Affirmation of being loved is like, I love you so much. I miss you. That's different. So emotional connection, variety and creativity, unpredictability, daring moments, incorporation of fantasy, physically pleasurable sensations. So if that's what somebody's interested in, you can have outer course for an hour and just, have one person blindfolded and just see what kind of different sensations that you can offer to your partner. And again, this is why sex therapy is so helpful because, a lot of people, they're like, that sounds like a good idea, but I don't know what to do. Like, how many different sensations can I create? Or like I have a worksheet that has like the 5 modalities of touch and the different kinds of intensities. So it gives you like a menu of things to try and explore with your partner. So I can't encourage people enough to get support for this if they need it. Spiritual connection, fun and play, spontaneity, what else? So, just to have couples start thinking about it. And another thing to think about in your couple style is initiation. Who initiates? Who do you want to initiate? And why? Like, these are really important questions for every couple to ask if they're trying to develop a sexual style. So, so that's some important conversations too, because a lot of times what gets in the way of a sexual relationship is the starting of it. It's getting there. Once they're there, people are glad to be there. They enjoy it, and they say, "Why don't we do this more often?" It's the getting there that that presents a problem for a lot of couples. So that has to do with initiation. Whose job it is and why, and how does this person like to initiate. And it's always a great conversation to have. I would encourage any listener to have this conversation tonight. How do you feel about initiating? How do you feel about me initiating? Would you like me to initiate more? How would you like me to initiate? And I'm certain you'll probably learn something if you haven't had this conversation before.
Yeah, that's a great exercise too, and again, so much meaning into that. I hear more often where the male is the initiator, and I think that goes back to a lot of the messaging we received growing up, where women are taught that they're to expect to be initiated upon, and they're supposed to protect themselves from that, and that men are going to be, men kind of get the message of, just try really hard to control yourself until you get married. And so, so there's this comfort for initiating, but I hear from men so often just this sadness, like, I'm not sure my wife really desires me or finds me attractive, because she never really is the one that starts things. I think it's our overall culture too. All the stories we grew up with, Cinderella, Snow White. It's like the man is the initiator, the actor. And we kind of wait around. We wait around, and we're pretty, and we make sure that we know that somebody wants to be attracted to us, but we're not. It's not till later, right, that we've had some of the Mulans and other stories where you see the woman actually being more of the actor and being proactive and getting what she wants and needs, and even rescuing the guy. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to be thinking about, is what's going on subconsciously for me that kind of gets in the way of some of these things.
Yeah, and it's different to say, to ask those questions and to say, why don't I initiate? And is it because I don't think I should, or is it because I don't really know how? So, those are questions that you can explore with your partner. Would you enjoy me initiating? And how would you enjoy me initiating? And another really important conversation right along that is, if I initiate and you're not interested in that moment, how can you respond to me in a way that affirms the initiation, in a way that I don't feel rejected? So I call it rain checking. So how can you offer a rain check in a way that makes it safe for your partner to initiate? Because, last thing people want to do is get rejected, especially when they're initiating a sexual encounter. It's extremely vulnerable. And if someone is rejected enough, they're going to stop initiating. It's just not worth it, So that's an important conversation for couples to say, how can we keep each other safe if one of us initiates and the other isn't quite up for it? What can we say? How can we respond so it's okay, and that we can try again the next, under a different circumstance? Or usually what I like to do is say, if one person isn't up for it, maybe they've got, work to do or whatever, that it's now that person's turn to initiate, to create a space. And maybe, again, spontaneous initiation is a difficult proposition for most families these days, because there's just not a lot of time. So, it's really more in terms of, okay, well, I'm going to plan a time. How does, 3 to 4 o'clock on Saturday look? Let's go. Let's take the car somewhere and let's go drive somewhere. Let's get a babysitter. Let's farm the kids out, or, let's go stay in a hotel room. It's interesting because, I work with a lot of infidelity, and, people spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and do a lot of efforting to have, time with this affair partner. And, I like to say, if you spent just 1/10 of that kind of energy, time, and verve for your partner, you wouldn't have this problem. In other words, people are willing to spend $150, $200 on a hotel room that they're only going to be in for 3 hours with their affair partner, but not with their spouse.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So have an affair with your partner.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of meaning ruts there with initiation and rejection, right? So, and it can go both ways. Like, oh, I feel awful. I don't want to reject, so I'm going to do something I'm really not that into, and that causes resentment, and because again, I don't want to hurt. It's this kind of idea that, and we're trying to protect each other, and yet we're actually not, because we're not being honest and vulnerable with one another, right? And it can go the other way too. Like, well, I'll try to initiate, and then if I get rejected, it can go both ways. I can either blame myself, like, oh, I'm such a loser, or I'm not attractive, or I'm not desirable, or I can be blaming the partner, like, you're so rigid or frigid or non-sexual, what's wrong with you? And we just can get into so many meaning ruts because our brains want to make connections of what these things mean, when really oftentimes it has nothing to do with the meanings we come up with.
No, exactly. Yeah, and when we blame, we know all we're really doing is discharging anger and pain. That's all blame is. So if you can, help a client or kind of have that introspection yourself and say, what am I actually feeling that I'm reacting to, instead of just being in that reaction, then you've got something to work with,
You had mentioned the work of Esther Perel, and that you want to maybe revisit something around this idea of maybe, was it peak erotic experiences, or...
I think so. I think we were talking about eroticism, and I think we did talk a little bit more about that in terms of using your imagination. But I really like her book, Mating in Captivity, because she really talks about the differences and the distinctions between committed love, which is, very, well, if I were to ask you, when you think of committed love, what do you think of? What are the things, Natasha, you think of committed love? You think of
partnership, marriage,
loyalty, friendship, trust, reliability, caretaking. You get cancer. It's committed love. He's there for you. You're there for him. That's what committed love is. It's beautiful. It's important. It's safety. It's anchoring. It's home. And we all long for that. It's a human need. And then, the other thing, though, is eroticism, which is actually quite different, because we tend to think about sexuality being in this kind of a caretaking way. And that can be an aspect of it. But for most people, when you think about eroticism and you think about a peak erotic experience, you're going to come up with a different set of adjectives. So when you think about, and I'll ask a group, like when you think about erotic desire, what comes to mind? And it's usually things like hot, dangerous, anticipation, uncertainty, longing, wanting. It's really owning the wanting. So it's quite different from committed love. So if the verb for love is to have, the verb for desire is to want. So it's a different thing energetically, And so what I suggest to couples, and I know I'm going to have a challenge when a couple comes in and they say, we have a great relationship. He's like my right arm. It's like we are one and the same, and we have zero eroticism in our relationship. Like our sex life is on the rails, which is counter to what most people assume. It's not that unusual for a couple to have a really loving companionship and to not have any eroticism or not enjoy a sexual connection in that relationship. So what can happen is a couple can become too familial. That's actually a term I think Tammy Nelson uses a lot. Familial, meaning that you start getting so familial where the space between you merges. So like you're farting in front of each other, you're going to the bathroom with the door open, you're doing things that just, you start experiencing yourselves as less separate and more just kind of one thing. And too much separateness, then that's not, then you're too far away. But I like how Esther talks about it, just a little bridge to cross. And so when you think about when you're most attracted to your partner, most people will say, when I see him or her in her element, when I see him or her doing something she loves, so there's a little bit of space where you can kind of see your partner through the eyes of another, being admired, this kind of turns you on to your partner. So I like to work with couples in terms of how can you take anticipation, which is mortar to desire, and infuse it into your committed, loving relationship. So that's some of the ideas that I like people to think about.
Yeah, I love that, because that fits right into this myth that although increasing your intimacy emotionally, like, Gottman talks about, friendship can increase your eroticism. That's not necessarily a complete correlate, because you do have people who really have horrific relationships and are having really great sex. And people who are best of friends, like you're mentioning, and really are not super passionate towards one another. And that can be really confusing. So it's interesting how these things balance each other out.
And every couple is different, and every person is different. And if there's one message that I could relay to your audience, is that you're normal, you're enough, and you're perfect. And the sexuality is something that we learn, is something that we work with our entire lives. It's not a box that we check. It's this thing that, we're going to have many sexualities in our lives. As our life changes, our sexuality will change. So, there's sexuality we have, before we're married, and there's a sexuality we have when we're newly married, and there's a different kind of sexuality that we experience when we have young kids, and financial demands, or different kinds of stressors, or sickness, or death. Different life circumstances are going to, and as we age, we're going to experience different sexualities. So I like to think of it that it's a part of ourselves that's worth cultivating and honoring and enjoying in a way that we find meaningful. And that's why I go back to that kind of sexual vision statement is do we want sex, or do we want a sexual connection to be important to us? Is it important to me? Is it important to you? If so, how can we create a context for us to really enjoy feeling this sexual connection together? And I pulled this up while we were looking. Sometimes I'll share this with couples as we get toward the end of the podcast. It feels like we should be getting close. It's this beautiful description of sexual intimacy that I've adapted from After the Affair by Janice Abrams-Bring. And, when I'm working with a couple around creating a sexual vision, I like to share this with them because I think it's really inspiring. So if you want, I'll share it with you. It's about, 30 seconds long.
I would love that.
Okay. So it says, what is sexual intimacy? Sexual intimacy means that in the presence of each other, you can feel emotionally safe and protected while being physically naked. You can be yourselves, yet feel connected. You value passion and playfulness in bed, while trusting that closeness matters more to you both than performance. You can acknowledge your own sexual fears and frustrations and still feel accepted and respected. You can ask openly for what pleases you sexually and set limits on what feels uncomfortable. You can have compassion for one another, knowing that what makes you insecure and imperfect also makes you human.
That's lovely.
I know, that totally moves me. I get choked up when I read that. I think it's really beautiful. I think it captures the essence of what it's about.
Yeah, these terms, right? Vulnerability and intimacy and connection and passion. And it's just, it can feel overwhelming, and yet it's such a, I like the idea of a journey and how you talked about the sexuality at different life stages, because it's again, another myth, I think, that as we age, we should just accept that we're not sexual anymore, or shouldn't be as sexual, when really it's the time, I think, when you really can take all your lived experience and really flourish in a way that you haven't been able to flourish before. I think it's a wonderful time to be thinking about your sexuality in your 50s, 60s, 70s,
Yeah, I'm with you. I think to the contrary, I believe my experience actually is sex gets better as you age, because you get better as you age.
I agree.
You have more self-acceptance, you have more confidence, hopefully, as you're going through life, and you get to relax more, and you get to feel more, I just think self-acceptance is the key. Once you have more self-acceptance, you know more what you want, you know your partner. So I think sex gets better as we age. For couples that stop being sexual as they age, over 80% of the time, it's due to the male partner's disengagement. And that, again, goes back to that old performance model of sex where it requires an erection. So when men maybe get into their 50s and 60s and their erections become less predictable and less reliable, rather than deal with that, which is, really uncomfortable to deal with, they opt out. So this is why, moving into a different narrative that says sex is really about kind of this circular model of just giving and receiving pleasure. An erection isn't required. Intercourse isn't required. There's lots of things that you can do to be sexually intimate and enjoy closeness and connection, which is really the point. Again, when I ask couples, why are we talking about this? Why is this important for you? Why is sex important? I'll get some combination of pleasure and connection. And so, that's the goal. The goal is pleasure and connection. And there's lots and lots of things that you can enjoy with a soft on, or without an erection, or post prostate cancer, or post mastectomy, that can embody pleasure and connection. And you get to make the rules of it. So I think it's an important shift to make. And those couples that make that shift, that get out of the performance model of sex, enjoy their sexuality into their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, I have so enjoyed our time together, and you've brought so much wisdom and just great information into this podcast. Is there anything that I'm not asking you that you wanted to make sure we covered, or any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
I don't think so. I think it's great that you do the work that you do, and I would just encourage people to reach out and get support. It sounds like you've got a good resource library, maybe online or something, for people can read. Or, if people ever have questions for me or want to work with me, my website is scottsdalesextherapy.com. I'm happy to answer questions if I can, and offer whatever support I can to help people through their life journey.
Lovely. Thank you for being on the show tonight, Isa.
My pleasure. Take care.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the now, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No, tishki so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.